They fought empires. They led armies. They changed the course of history. But their names were deliberately erased from the books you read in school. Today, we're bringing back 9 of the most powerful black warriors the world tried to forget. Their stories will change everything you thought you knew about history. For centuries, history has been written by the victors, and more often than not, those victors were European colonizers who had a very specific narrative to push. They wanted the world to believe that civilization, intelligence, and military genius belonged exclusively to them. So they did something calculated and deliberate. They erased the stories of black warriors, kings, and military leaders who challenged that narrative. They rewrote textbooks, destroyed records, and buried the truth under layers of lies and propaganda. But here's the thing about truth. It doesn't stay buried forever. Archaeological discoveries, surviving oral histories, and documents that escaped destruction are now revealing what was hidden for so long. The warriors we're about to discuss weren't just skilled fighters. They were brilliant strategists, fearless leaders, and individuals who shaped the course of human history in ways that still echo today. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. These are the stories they don't want you to know, and we're going to keep bringing them to light. Drop a comment telling us which warrior you want to learn more about. Now, let's begin. The story begins in feudal Japan, during a time when the country was torn apart by civil war. In 1579, something unprecedented happened. An African man arrived on Japanese shores, and he would soon become the first and only black samurai in Japanese history. His name was Yasuke, and his story reads like something out of an epic film. Yasuke came from somewhere in East Africa, likely Mozambique. He arrived in Japan as a servant to an Italian Jesuit missionary. When he walked through the streets of Kyoto, people had never seen anyone like him. Crowds gathered in such numbers that there was nearly a riot. Everyone wanted to see this tall, powerfully built man with dark skin. Some Japanese people thought his skin had been painted with ink and tried to scrub it off. But one man saw something different. Oda Nobunaga, the most powerful warlord in Japan and the man who would nearly unify the entire country, was fascinated. He summoned Yasuke to his castle, and what happened next changed everything. Nobunaga was so impressed by Yasuke's strength, intelligence, and bearing that he did something almost unthinkable. He made this African man a samurai. This wasn't a ceremonial title. Yasuke became a real samurai warrior. He was given a katana, a house, a stipend, and land. He fought in actual battles alongside Nobunaga and became one of his most trusted bodyguards. When Nobunaga's enemies finally cornered and killed him, Yasuke fought to the very end to protect his lord. The attacking forces were so impressed by his courage that they spared his life, saying he was not Japanese and didn't understand their customs. For centuries, Japanese historians downplayed Yasuke's role or ignored him completely. His story didn't fit the narrative of Japanese cultural purity that some wanted to maintain. Western historians ignored him entirely, but the truth survived in Japanese records and chronicles. And now, centuries later, Yasuke is finally getting the recognition he deserves as a symbol of black excellence in the most unexpected place. While Yasuke was fighting in Japan, across the world in Africa, a baby girl was born who would become one of the most formidable military leaders in history. Queen Nzinga ruled Angola for 40 years, and during that entire time, she made the Portuguese colonizers' lives absolute hell. Nzinga was born into royalty in the Kingdom of Ndongo in 1583. From childhood, she was trained in warfare, politics, and diplomacy. She watched as Portuguese slave traders invaded her homeland, kidnapping her people and destroying her culture. When she became queen in her 40s, she made a decision. She would never submit to European rule, no matter what it cost. And the Portuguese learned very quickly that they had severely underestimated this woman. Nzinga was a military genius who understood something most African leaders of her time didn't grasp until too late. You couldn't fight European guns and cannons with traditional warfare. So she pioneered guerrilla warfare tactics in Africa, using the terrain, surprise attacks, and brilliant strategic thinking to defeat larger, better-armed Portuguese forces again and again. She formed alliances with the Dutch, who were enemies of Portugal, turning European rivalries to her advantage. She united multiple kingdoms under her leadership, creating a powerful coalition against colonization. And here's the remarkable part. She led armies personally, riding into battle well into her 60s, fighting alongside her warriors. The Portuguese threw everything they had at her for 40 years. They couldn't break her. When she died at age 81, she had never surrendered, never submitted, and never stopped fighting. The Portuguese had to wait until after her death to finally gain full control of Angola, and even then, the resistance she inspired continued for generations. European historians buried her story because she represented everything that contradicted their colonial propaganda. How could they claim Africans needed to be civilized when this brilliant African queen had defeated them for 4 decades? So they erased her, marginalized her, and tried to make the world forget. But in Angola, she's a national hero, and her story is finally spreading worldwide. Now we travel further back in time to ancient Carthage in North Africa. In 247 BC, a boy was born who would become Rome's worst nightmare and one of the greatest military commanders in all of human history. His name was Hannibal Barca, and what he accomplished still defies belief. Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, was a Carthaginian general who hated Rome with a burning passion. When Hannibal was just 9 years old, his father made him swear an oath to be Rome's eternal enemy. That oath would shape the course of Western history. Hannibal was trained as a soldier from childhood, learning strategy, tactics, and the art of war from the best military minds in Carthage. When Hannibal became commander of Carthaginian forces, he did something no one thought possible. He decided to attack Rome directly, but Rome controlled the Mediterranean Sea. So Hannibal marched his army through Spain, across the Pyrenees Mountains, and then performed one of the most legendary military feats in history. He crossed the Alps with 50,000 troops and 37 war elephants. The journey killed nearly half his men and most of his elephants, but when he descended into Italy, the Romans were completely unprepared. For the next 15 years, Hannibal won battle after battle against Rome. At the Battle of Cannae, he faced a Roman army of 87,000 men with only 50,000 of his own troops. Using brilliant tactical encirclement, he killed 70,000 Roman soldiers in a single day. It remains one of the most devastating defeats in military history. Rome was terrified. For years, Roman parents scared their children by saying, "Hannibal is at the gates." He came closer to destroying the Roman Empire than anyone before or since. So why isn't he celebrated as the military genius he was? Because European historians spent centuries trying to claim he wasn't really African. They called him Phoenician, Mediterranean, anything but Black African, despite the fact that Carthage was in North Africa and contemporary accounts described his appearance. The truth is, Hannibal was an African military genius who nearly brought Rome to its knees, and that fact was too inconvenient for the narrative that Europeans wanted to tell about themselves. In the kingdom of Dahomey, In what is now Benin, West Africa, something extraordinary existed for over 200 years. An elite fighting force of women warriors so fierce and skilled that they terrified everyone who faced them in combat. They were called the Dahomey Amazons, and they were real. These weren't mythological figures or exaggerations. They were a professional, highly trained, all-female military regiment that made up a significant portion of Dahomey's army. At their peak, there were around 6,000 of these warriors. They started in the 17th century as elephant hunters, but their skills caught the attention of the king, who made them his official bodyguards. The training these women underwent was brutal. They started as young girls and were molded into warriors through intense physical conditioning, weapons training, and mental discipline. They took vows of celibacy and dedicated their lives entirely to warfare. They were known for their fearlessness, often attacking fortified positions that male soldiers wouldn't dare approach. European observers who saw them in action described them as the most disciplined and formidable troops in all of West Africa. When French colonial forces invaded Dahomey in the late 19th century, the Amazons fought them with everything they had. French soldiers later admitted that the female warriors were more courageous and dangerous than the male troops. The Amazons fought to the last woman in many battles, refusing to surrender even when defeat was certain. European colonizers found these women deeply threatening, not just militarily, but ideologically. They challenged racist stereotypes about Africans and sexist ideas about women's capabilities. So their story was suppressed, minimized, and eventually erased from mainstream history. Only in recent years, partly thanks to their portrayal as inspiration for the Dora Milaje in Black Panther, has their story begun reaching wider audiences. But these warriors were far more than fiction. They were real, they were deadly, and they deserve to be remembered. In 1311, almost 2 centuries before Christopher Columbus supposedly discovered the Americas, an African emperor did something that history has tried desperately to forget. Mansa Abu Bakr II, ruler of the Mali Empire, the richest kingdom on earth at that time, became obsessed with a question. What lay beyond the Atlantic Ocean? Abu Bakr ruled an empire that stretched across West Africa, controlling the gold and salt trade that made Mali fabulously wealthy. But he was an explorer at heart. He assembled a fleet of 200 ships and sent them across the Atlantic to discover what was on the other side. When only one ship returned, reporting that the others had been swallowed by a great river in the ocean, Abu Bakr didn't give up. He did something even more audacious. He assembled a second fleet, this one numbering 2,000 ships, carrying thousands of people, supplies, and trade goods. Then he did something no other emperor in history has done. He abdicated his throne, gave power to his brother, and personally led this massive expedition into the unknown. He sailed west into the Atlantic and never returned. For centuries, historians dismissed this as legend or fantasy, but evidence has been mounting. Indigenous peoples in Central and South America, the Caribbean, and even North America have oral histories of black visitors arriving by sea long before Europeans. Archaeological evidence shows African plants and artifacts in pre-Columbian America. The currents and winds would have carried West African ships directly to the Caribbean and South America. Why was this erased? Because it destroys the entire narrative of Columbus discovering a new world. It means Africans were exploring and possibly settling in the Americas 200 years before Europeans. That's too revolutionary for traditional history books to handle. But the evidence is there, and more emerges every year. Abu Bakr may have accomplished what history books won't admit. reaching the Americas long before Europe even tried. In 1879, the British Empire was at the height of its power, controlling a quarter of the world's land and people. They had modern rifles, artillery, and the most professional army on earth. They believed they were invincible. Then they met Cetshwayo Kampande, king of the Zulu nation, and learned a lesson in humility. Cetshwayo inherited a kingdom with a rich military tradition. The Zulu were organized into highly disciplined regiments called impis, warriors trained from youth in coordinated combat tactics. When British forces invaded Zululand under false pretenses, looking to destroy Zulu independence, Cetshwayo tried diplomacy first. When that failed, he gave the order to defend their homeland. At Isandlwana, 20,000 Zulu warriors armed primarily with spears and shields faced 1,800 British troops, with rifles, artillery, and modern military equipment. On paper, it should have been a slaughter, with the Zulu destroyed by superior firepower. Instead, what happened shocked the world. Using sophisticated tactics, the Zulu force completely surrounded and annihilated the British column. Over 1,300 British soldiers were killed. It was the worst defeat a colonial power had suffered against an indigenous African army. The British Empire was humiliated. How could primitive African warriors defeat the world's most powerful military? The answer was simple. The Zulu weren't primitive. They were highly organized, brilliantly led, and fighting for their homeland. Cetshwayo proved that African military genius could defeat European technology. British historians spent the next century downplaying Isandlwana and focusing instead on Rorke's Drift, a minor battle where British forces successfully defended a position. They turned it into a propaganda victory to distract from their devastating loss. Cetshwayo's brilliant victory was buried in footnotes, while British heroism was celebrated in films and books. But the truth remains. An African king led his warriors to one of the most shocking military victories in colonial history. In Haiti in the 1790s, enslaved Africans did something that colonial powers believed was impossible. They rose up, overthrew their enslavers, and defeated multiple European armies to create the first free Black Republic in the Western Hemisphere. And leading them was a man who had been enslaved for over 40 years. His name was Toussaint Louverture, and he became one of the greatest military leaders in history. Toussaint was born enslaved on a plantation, but was fortunate enough to have an enslaver who allowed him to learn to read. He educated himself, studying military strategy, history, and philosophy. When the Haitian Revolution erupted, Toussaint was already in his 50s, but he quickly rose to leadership through sheer brilliance. He organized enslaved people into a disciplined army, teaching them tactics and strategy. Then he started defeating professional European forces. French troops, who had conquered much of Europe, couldn't defeat Toussaint's forces. When the British sent 40,000 troops to capture Haiti and reimpose slavery, Toussaint outmaneuvered them, using guerrilla warfare and knowledge of the terrain to destroy the British invasion. Spain also tried and failed. Toussaint wasn't just a warrior. He was a political genius who created a constitution, reorganized Haiti's economy, and tried to build a functioning nation from the ashes of slavery. He did all this while fighting wars on multiple fronts against the most powerful empires on earth. Napoleon Bonaparte, probably the greatest military mind in European history, called Toussaint one of the most remarkable men of his age. Napoleon eventually captured Toussaint through deception and imprisoned him in France, where he died. But the revolution continued, and Haiti won its independence, becoming the only nation in history born from a successful slave revolt. Why was Toussaint's story buried. Because every colonial power was terrified. They couldn't let enslaved people around the world know that it was possible to win. His story was deliberately suppressed, his genius minimized, and his achievements erased from mainstream history. But in Haiti and among people who know the truth, Toussaint Louverture remains what he always was: a liberator, a genius, and a warrior who defeated empires. While Toussaint was still enslaved in Haiti, another African revolutionary had already won his freedom and created something remarkable in Mexico. Gaspar Yanga was believed to be of royal blood from what is now Gabon. Enslaved and brought to Mexico, then called New Spain, Yanga refused to accept his bondage. In 1570, he escaped to the mountains of Veracruz and did something extraordinary. He founded a free settlement of escaped slaves and successfully defended it for over 30 years. Yanga's community, hidden in the highlands, became a beacon of hope for enslaved Africans throughout Mexico. They conducted raids on Spanish trade routes, freeing enslaved people and acquiring supplies. Spanish colonial authorities sent multiple military expeditions to destroy the settlement. But Yanga's forces knew the terrain and fought with the desperation of people who knew capture meant death or re-enslavement. For 3 decades, this community remained free, growing in size and strength. Finally, in 1618, the Spanish decided that conquering Yanga was impossible. They negotiated a peace treaty, officially recognizing the settlement's freedom. Yanga's town still exists today, now called Yanga, Veracruz, making it one of the first free black settlements in the Americas. So why don't more people know about Gaspar Yanga? Because Mexican national identity has historically focused on indigenous and Spanish heritage, largely ignoring the African-Mexican experience. Yanga's story disrupts the narrative and reveals an uncomfortable truth. Africans were fighting for freedom in the Americas long before independence movements began. But in recent years, especially among Afro-Mexican communities, Yanga is being recognized as the hero and freedom fighter he truly was. Our final warrior takes us back to the 13th century, to West Africa, where a boy was born who couldn't walk. Prophecy said he would become a great king, but his enemies laughed at this disabled child. His name was Sundiata Keita, and he would prove everyone wrong by founding one of the greatest empires in human history. Sundiata was born around 1217 in the kingdom of Kangaba. He suffered from a condition that left him unable to walk as a child, and his enemies mocked him mercilessly. But Sundiata refused to accept limitation. Through determination and willpower, he taught himself to walk using an iron staff. Once he could walk, he trained himself as a warrior, becoming incredibly strong. When a tyrant king conquered Sundiata's homeland and killed his family, Sundiata was in exile. He returned with an army, united 12 kingdoms of West Africa under his leadership, and defeated the Soso Empire at the Battle of Quirina. That victory established the Mali Empire, which would become larger than Western Europe and one of the richest civilizations on Earth. But Sundiata wasn't just a warrior. He was a visionary leader who created the Mandan Charter, one of the oldest constitutions in the world, and one that included human rights concepts like the abolition of slavery, food security, and freedom of expression. This was in 1222, decades before the Magna Carta and centuries before European Enlightenment philosophy supposedly invented these concepts. Under Sundiata's leadership and that of his successors, Mali became a center of learning, trade, and culture. The city of Timbuktu housed universities that attracted scholars from around the world. The empire's wealth was so legendary that when Mansa Musa, Sundiata's grandnephew, made a pilgrimage to Mecca, He brought so much gold that he crashed the Mediterranean economy. Why was Sundiata's story erased from Western education? Because it completely destroys the narrative that Africa had no great civilizations, no sophisticated governments, no remarkable leaders. Sundiata built an empire that rivaled anything in Europe, with more progressive laws and greater wealth. That's too inconvenient for textbooks that want to portray Africa as primitive and in need of European civilization. 9 warriors. 9 stories that were buried, erased, or distorted. From Japan to Angola, from ancient Carthage to medieval Mali, from Haiti to Mexico, these warriors changed history. They defeated empires, founded nations, crossed oceans, and proved that brilliance, courage, and military genius have never belonged to just one race or one continent. But these 9 are just the beginning. There are hundreds, probably thousands, of black warriors, leaders, scientists, and innovators whose stories have been systematically erased from history. Every time you hear someone say that Africa had no great civilizations, remember Sundiata and Queen Nzinga. Every time someone suggests that black people were passive victims of history, remember Toussaint and Gaspar Yanga. Every time you're told that certain achievements belong only to Europe, remember Hannibal and the Dahomey Amazons. History matters. Not ancient history for its own sake, but because the lies we've been told about the past shape how we see the present. When entire peoples are written out of history, when their achievements are stolen or erased, it's not an accident. It's a deliberate choice made by people who wanted to justify oppression, colonization, and racism. These 9 warriors are just the beginning. There are hundreds more stories that have been erased, ignored, or stolen. If this video opened your eyes, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear these stories. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because we're bringing you more hidden history every week. Which warrior's story shocked you the most? Drop it in the comments below. And if you want to learn more about any of these warriors, check out the links in the description. Remember, they tried to erase these heroes from history, but we're bringing them back. Share this video everywhere. Let's make sure these names are never forgotten again. The truth won't stay buried. See you in the next one.